see empty horizon, a clear sky, a forest reduced to a plowed field. Purity correlates to the humanist paradigm, he continues, because that paradigm aspires to trace the image of man emerging from an orderly context. The Alps and the Po, in the context of the cinematic frame, defy the possibility of completeness. Though the camera pans along the Po and around the Alps, both landscapes exceed the boundaries of the frame and give a sense of their immensity beyond it. And as the films draw away from their individual subject matters, they encourage us to think beyond the frame. If we do so, we might realize that the right distances Po River originates in the province of Cuneo, the very same province of the Valle Mayra, the setting of The Wind Blows Round. Digging a little deeper, we discover that a tributary of the Po, the Mayra River, flows through The Wind Blows Round in several scenes. So the waters we observe in one film have quite literally flowed into the frame from the other. This geographic coincidence reveals the ecological interconnectedness of these two apparently remote Italian villages and these two cinematic moments, and it points to the intensity and the urgency of the project of cohabitation. Thank you. So thank you so much. I'd be delighted if you have any questions or observations. And I'll say that I was really excited to realize that the Po does indeed start in the Alps. I was a little geographically confused about how the top of Italy works. But yes, Catherine.
But you had mentioned, and I'm wondering if there's something made of it in the film, or if you make something of it, that we have a French goat man cheesemaker who was a philosopher. I mean, what's said by that? What do you take that to mean? That he's a retired philosopher. Is that what you said?
Yes, indeed. I mean, and obviously somebody who has rebelled against the academic institution in particular, but remains very much a philosopher, which contributes to his perception as a sort of bohemian outsider. But it does contribute interesting conversations with some of the town's residents. He talks about, and as defining terms, he talks about tolerance, for example, a term that he dislikes immensely because it implies that someone has to be tolerated, and sort of incorporates, I think, a philosophy of praxis over a philosophy of a sort of more abstract way of relating to an institution. We get the idea, it's a really brief mention in the film, that something like what's happening to them in Chersonio has happened to this family before, that indeed they've been in another town. I think Felipe is jealous of his wife, and additionally they have this conflict with small town life. So I think there's also the implication that although he's attempting to institute this praxis of cohabitation, he has a hard time with it. He's someone who doesn't cohabit spaces easily because he's kind of demanding in terms of his ideals for those places. And so I think that we see the sort of encounter of theory and praxis in Philippe himself, and the dangers of adopting too utopian a vision of what that can look like.
Is this a movie directed largely toward the present moment of philosophy and philosophers in Italy?
Is it a movie that, sorry?
The audience of the movie. I mean, I don't have a sense of that either. Is this a cautionary tale, or some sort of bringing home to philosophers a certain message?
I think.
How does it escape nationalism?
I think it's really interesting in terms of its audience, because there's a way in which regionalism and regional enthusiasm ends up creating an audience that this film wouldn't have had otherwise. And so it screened actually at our film festival here in Detroit, but it had a sort of limited circuit, in fact very untraditional means of production. They borrowed goats. In fact, I have a couple of slides at the end credits where they say, "Thanks for loaning us the goats," and such. And so it circulates to great enthusiasm to people who, I'm not sure hear its cautionary message so much as they actually hear the soundtrack, the Occitane. People are from the region, people who recognize themselves in that region are excited about seeing themselves represented, regardless of the fact that it's such a dystopic representation of the community. But I mean, it's from that very border region that almost is a position of exile from Italian, a sort of mainstream Italian national perception of itself. And I think that makes one wonder about whether an audience is also a sort of intellectual Italian group of philosophers who might live in exile, or perhaps not, and who are thinking about this.
And so much of earlier Italian cinema, you've got the presence of Christianity in many of the narratives. And is there a kind of dichotomy here, possibly, between Christian and non-Christian, or pre-Christian?
You know, I think that's an interesting question. I guess I think of a lot of Italian cinema, especially the Italian cinema that we study in the U.S. as having such a strong Marxist framework. That but there's often sort of a Christian humanism that's invoked.
Right.
And so in lots of films you see a sort of a weird combination of the Marxist and the Catholic that work together. But in these films I think the dichotomy is stronger. In fact, I was noticing rewatching this film that there are very ironic juxtapositions of the community, like in a Catholic procession for their saint day, who are encountering the French family in very sort of unchristian terms. And I think there is sort of a critique of cultural Catholicism. It's sort of pointing out the ways it doesn't live up to its cultural sort of humanistic goals.
And also the notion of the web is almost Asian, Buddhist.
Yes, I think that's a good point, and I think that I'm trying to remember the context in which I've heard an Italian recently redefine Catholicism and try to think about it again with the small c, trying to be able to incorporate a vision of Catholicism in its original term of, I think, sort of open tastes, desire to choose from sort of a wide, I can't define it exactly, but Catholicism with a small c as sort of eclectic tastes and a wider acceptance of possible definitions, and I think we see that sometimes incorporated in these films. La Giusta Distanza doesn't really even reference the Catholic Church at all, but it's definitely an important moment, and there is a priest figure in The Wind Blows Round who's central to trying to encourage the town to think ethically, although as they practice Catholicism independently, they're not always doing so in a consistent fashion.
Well, this is a question about influence, and I have another question about philosophy and film, but there's a lot of philosophers in America and Britain that are anti-speciesist, Peter Singer being one of the leading ones, Tom Reagan, Mylon Engel, and I wonder if they have any influence on the people, the philosophers you cite. And the other question I have about philosophy and film is, do you have a view about the relationship between film and philosophy? That is, specifically, can film illustrate a philosophical position or justify one, or do you have a view about what the relation might be?
I think I'm interested in actually hearing you say more about the anti-speciesist philosophers. But in terms of a film illustrating a philosophical position, I mean, I think that I would use the term ethics more confidently than the term philosophy, and I think that very often in these contemporary Italian films we're seeing sort of the question of ethical being in a contemporary Italian setting, that they're posed as debates within the films themselves. And so you see these different points of view that are illustrated, and depending on the director, some of them make very clear their sort of arrival point, their own ethical position, and sometimes they leave things very much more open-ended, so that a viewer might sort of witness the debate but come away with the sort of freedom to interpret that ethical position according to their own ethical background.